start, but once those clear away, it's actually generally going to be quite a bright day on offer. Plenty of dry weather around, just a few showers perhaps feeding into southern parts of England and later on into Wales and the Midlands. Once again, though, across Scotland, those blustery winds continuing, those risk of coastal gales around northwestern exposed spots and fair amount of cloud around too, with a risk of some light rain at times. Generally, temperatures around about average, but just above across the south and southeast, highs of around 16 to 17 Celsius. Once again for Thursday, once any fog clears in the morning, largely dry and bright across the country, but out to the west we do have some cloud continuing to spill in through the course of the day with some outbreaks of rain by the time we reach the afternoon. This could be heavy and fairly blustery under those cloudy skies too. More rain and showers as we head towards the weekend with average temperatures. Otherwise, that's it from me. Bye-bye.
We'll see a cold snap, which will quickly develop into a warm front. Boxed Boiler Repairs, sponsors of weather on GB News.
This is the final week to grab your chance to win a whopping £36,000 cash in the Great British Giveaway. That's like having £3,000 each month for an entire year. Extra cash in your bank account that you can do whatever you like with. Make sure you don't miss out. Get your entry in now. Just one entry could make you the winner. For another chance to win £36,000 in tax-free cash, text CASH to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus one standard network rate message, or text BONUS to 63232. 5 entries cost £5 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries start from just £2, or post your name and number to GB08 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close 5 PM this Friday. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Welcome to State of the Nation, daily plunge into the stories shaping our country. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Monday to Thursday we bring you the insights, the facts, the truth about how our country is being governed. Because what happens in Downing Street matters down your street. Tune in to State of the Nation every Monday to Thursday, 8 to 9 o'clock. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good Afternoon Britain isn't just about us. The wonderful thing about this programme is it's about everyone watching. It's an interactive programme.
Well, there absolutely is something to see here, and we're going to be talking about it more.
Whether it's breaking royal news,
Will, please bring us up to date.
or indeed a particularly punchy speech in the House of Commons,
Very, very curious.
we bring it to you live, and then we bring you live reaction as well.
That's Good Afternoon Britain, weekdays from midday.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Why go out on a Friday night when Friday night comes straight to your home?
Talking about?
Join me and my A-team of top pundits. Chemistry tonight is electric. As we tackle the big stories of the day with wit, insight and fearless energy.
Man of the people.
It's all vibe.
Just a filing cabinet on wheels with a tie on.
So, order in Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, every Friday at 8, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Mark Dolan tonight is your weekend dose of news, debate and entertainment. This sounds like a wild conspiracy theory. Don't miss my big opinion. Mark Meets and my take at 10. Democracy is a funny old thing. And we don't do boring, not on my watch. I just won't have it. Let's go and get another glass of that bubbly. You've earned it. That's Mark Dolan tonight, Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 11, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation. Tonight, more damning revelations for the Crown Prosecution Service and the Independent Office for Police Conduct. Chris Kaba turned out to be a core member of a London gang responsible for stabbings, shootings and murders. Who will be held to account? Has the BBC kowtowed to China and Labour's plans to reset relations with the totalitarian superpower? Senior BBC journalists are being recalled from China, Russia and North Korea. The question is, why? Angela Rayner's plans to turn the United Kingdom into a miniature European Union with an overhaul of workers' rights could lead to a £5 billion a year bill to employers. Plus, Labour has decided to release even more prisoners, supposedly to free up space. But I have a much better idea: to open up spaces that wouldn't put you, the public, at risk. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by my illustrious panel, journalist and author Michael Crick and the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng. As ever, it's a crucial part of the programme. Let me know your views, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now, it's your favourite time of the day, the News Bulletin with Sophia Wensler.
Jacob, thank you. Good evening. These are your headlines just after 8 o'clock. Chris Kaba, who was shot dead by police in September 2022, was a major figure in one of London's most notorious gangs and was accused of being involved in 2 shootings just days before he died. Court reporting restrictions have now been lifted, revealing his ties to a nightclub shooting and a second incident with gunshot residue and a balaclava found on him when he died. Police officer Martin Blake was cleared of the 24-year-old's murder yesterday after a jury acquitted him in just over 3 hours. Kaba's family say they're devastated over the verdict, vowing to continue their fight for justice. The Independent Office for Police Conduct is now considering whether Blake will face disciplinary action. Now, more than 1,000 prisoners are being released early today as part of the government's efforts to free up space in jails. 1,700 inmates were freed last month after warnings that as few as 80 prison places were available. Currently, there are just over 2,000 free spaces, but that number is expected to reach critical capacity again by next summer. Meanwhile, our GB News North West reporter, Sophie Reaper, was outside HMP Kirkham this morning, where alongside prisoners being released, one prisoner escaped.
Well, today is all about the government's early release scheme, but here at HMP Kirkham today, we've seen someone leave this prison under more unorthodox measures. Earlier when we were reporting, we saw a man appear on top of this fence, which you can see in the distance, which is topped with barbed wire. He jumped down to where a black vehicle was waiting for him with the car door open. He hopped in the vehicle and the vehicle left at speed. Now, the police are now investigating and the prison have told us that a roll call will now need to take place to try and determine exactly which prisoner it is that's managed to escape from HMP Kirkham.
In other news, Conservative MPs have delivered a 130,000 signature petition to Number 10 today, calling on the Chancellor and the Prime Minister not to hike fuel duty in their October budget. Over 70 Tory MPs have already written to Rachel Reeves, calling for the freeze on fuel duty to continue. That's after reports of a 7p rise on the way. If it goes ahead, it would be the first time fuel duty has been hiked in 14 years after successive Tory chancellors blocked it every year. And the former CEO of Abercrombie & Fitch has been charged with running a prostitution and international sex trafficking business. Mike Jeffries, along with his partner Matthew Smith and alleged middleman James Jacobson, were taken into custody this morning. The arrests follow an FBI investigation sparked by claims the couple coerced young men into having sex at parties thrown for the American fashion brand. Lawyers for Jeffries and Smith have both previously denied any wrongdoing. Those are the latest GB News headlines. More in an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. De mortuis nil nisi bono, of the dead say nothing but good, but the truth about Chris Kaba has come to light. Not only does it vindicate Sergeant Martin Blake, who ought to be given a medal for keeping the public safe, it now shines a light on all those who disgraced themselves and continue to disgrace themselves today. It turns out that Chris Kaba was a gangster, a hoodlum, a violent criminal. A mere 6 days before he was shot by Martin Blake, Kaba shot a gang rival in Hackney. He was a core member of the Brixton-based 6-7 gang that stabs, shoots, murders people and deals with illicit drugs too. So now it's time to name the list of people who I think really ought to hang their heads in shame. Former leader of the Labour Party said this shortly after the shooting. We cannot live the pain felt by his family, but we can support them in demanding justice for Chris Kaba. After it was referred to CPS, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, said this last year. My thoughts are with Chris Kaba's loved ones today. Chris had his whole life ahead of him, and his death has had a huge impact on Londoners, and in particular black Londoners. He claims to be in regular contact with Metropolitan Police, advises them when to send police outriders for pop stars. So surely he must have known about Chris Kaba's criminal background? Does the Mayor of London really think so little of black Londoners that they would identify with a gang member and a thug? The Runnymede Trust issued a statement just yesterday claiming Kaba's death was a case of racist state violence, citing statistics that could have whipped up racial tensions. This is an institution that receives your money via the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Black Lives Matter UK once again showed its extremist tendencies when it encouraged crowds to go and protest outside the Old Bailey last night, bizarrely arguing for police and prison abolition. Even the judge in the case, Mr. Justice Goss, to me behaved oddly in not allowing the jury to know about Kaba's background. That he was a criminal clearly shows the policeman's fear that lives were at risk was a justified one, and that the policeman made the right decision in the heat of the moment, even if he didn't at that time know who Kaba was. But perhaps worst of all, the acting director of operations of the Independent Office for Police Conduct, the body that recommended CPS pursue charges against Sergeant Blake, Amanda Rowe, said, firstly, we want to acknowledge Chris Kaba's family and friends today as they continue to grieve his death more than 2 years on. Our thoughts and sympathies remain with them and everyone else who has been affected. The past few weeks must have been incredibly difficult and distressing for Chris's family, who have sat through the trial, listened to all the evidence and witnessed the final moments played out in court. Firstly, but surely firstly, we should be thinking about Sergeant Blake, a man who did his duty, not the family of a gangster whose death was ended because of his own actions and failing to surrender to the police when challenged. What about his life? About Sergeant Martin's life that has been ruined over the past 2 years? He's now living in protection because the mobsters, have a price on his head. He's been dragged through the courts. He could have been sent to prison for life for murder. He triggered a strike from firearms officers which put the public's safety at risk because they thought one of their own was being treated so badly, and we now know that they were right. The IOP spokesman decides to express sorrow for the wrong person, for a criminal gangster who shot someone days before his death. This dreadful organisation is now suggesting a misconduct hearing for Martin Blake, which is a monstrous, an outrageous, a wicked suggestion, and it ignores the basic fairness of the double jeopardy rule, which runs through our justice system, which prohibits somebody from being tried for the same offence twice. They must drop this proposal. They should be ashamed of themselves, and this case should remind us of two things. One, that the police risk their lives daily to protect us, the public, and it is our duty to back them in return. And two, there is an establishment at work that undermines our police through the cynical politics of sectarianism and race baiting. We must not fall for it, and must remove its influence in our institutions and instead encourage heroes like Sergeant Martin Blake who try to keep us safe. Let me know your views, mailmog@gbnews.com. Well, I'm joined now by the veteran human rights campaigner, Peter Tatchell. Peter, it's always a pleasure to have you on the programme. I feel this has just been so unfair to the policeman concerned who had a split-second decision to make, and it turned out he shot somebody who was a gangster. Once that was known, surely he didn't need to be dragged through the courts.
Well, I support the police in exercising their role to protect the public by lawful means. I hold no brief for Chris Kaba. Clearly, the evidence does suggest, perhaps not proven, but does suggest that he was involved in serious criminality. So I've no brief to defend.
He'd been to prison for serious criminality, and whether he was involved in the shooting before, there seems to be very good evidence. But you're right, he wasn't convicted.
But the facts of the case are that the police stopped Chris Kaba in the street. They boxed in his car. It was stationary at the time he was shot. The police said, put your hands on, show us your hands. He put his hands on the steering wheel. Clearly he wasn't armed, yet the police officer in charge, or the police officer concerned, did then fire a shot at point-blank range into his head. Now, the question is, there was no serious threat to the police at that moment. Why did he shoot at his head and not his body to disable him, if he had to shoot at all? And secondly, we must ask the Crown Prosecution Service, how do they justify a charge of murder? There's no evidence that Mr. Officer Blake intended to kill Chris Kaba. So the intention was not there, so a murder charge was not appropriate. He perhaps should have been charged with manslaughter, which is killing without intention, but not murder. And I think that the case has been messed up by that flawed decision by the Crown Prosecution Service.
Well, I think we both agree that the CPS is a failing institution, though perhaps for slightly different reasons. I think in terms of what actually happened, the car had been driving back and forwards, that policemen had been surrounding it and had to jump away as it moved. Cars can kill. They are an effective deadly weapon. We had, just a couple of years ago, a policeman who was run over by escaping criminals and killed, that it was a perfectly reasonable suspicion in the minds of the police that they might be in danger.
Well, the evidence is that the car was stationary at that time.
But it had been moving back and forth.
Yeah,
so
but then it stopped.
There was nothing to stop it going again. He had his hands on the steering wheel. He didn't have them up off the steering wheel, so he could easily have put his foot on the accelerator again.
Yes, I agree. That's a difficult judgment. But I think,
and he had powder residue on his sleeve from a gunshot. So yes, no gun was found in the car. But he'd used firearms recently. He had cocaine in his system. So you had somebody high on drugs. The car had been seen around a shooting in the last couple of days. The police suspicions were rightly quite high of the intentions of the person.
I agree. I agree the police were right to be suspicious, right to be cautious, right to be protective of themselves and the public. But I think that when the state acts, or its agents act, they have to act with lawful purpose, with justification. And in this particular case, personally, I don't think that the shooting of Chris Kaba in the head, unarmed, with his hands on the wheel, that was justified. That's my personal view.
No, I understand that. And I agree with you. I think that always when the state uses its lethal force, there should be a proper inquiry as to why it takes place. But I think the prosecution was a step too far. And I think the IOPC now saying he will be investigated potentially for misconduct is deeply unfair. I've always thought that the protection against double jeopardy is one of the fundamental fairnesses of our system, because the state can otherwise drag you through the courts for the rest of your life, just endlessly, if it gets a result it doesn't like. And you, the citizen, are relatively powerless. And double jeopardy is one of our most long-standing and, I think, important protections.
But the IPOC is not planning to prosecute him again. It's just suggesting that he may be investigated for misconduct.
Misconduct, but that's...
And I think it's a very, very difficult decision to take. But you've got to understand how black communities in this country feel. There have been so many black men killed in police custody, dozens, over the last decades. So many. And no officers, by and large, very few officers, ever are called to account. And I think black people feel that they're under attack. And in this particular case, you know, Chris Kaba should have been under investigation, should have been apprehended, but he should have been apprehended with minimum force to make him stand in a court of law to answer those charges according to British law.
I think there is
That's the way we operate. That's our high standard.
Yeah, I think there is also a broader point that we ought to get more information. So I think what the Mayor of London said, Chris had his whole life ahead of him, and his death's had a huge impact on Londoners, and in particular black Londoners. I think if people, Londoners, all Londoners, regardless of race, had known that this was a serious gangster at the point at which it happened, people would have understood much more why the police acted as they did, and that our contempt of court laws, which are there to protect a free trial, actually stir up tension in communities, and indeed could have led to riots in this instance.
Well, that's what some people are saying, that the police are putting out this information now in order to dampen the prospect of coming riots.
But I think we should have known it earlier.
Yeah. Well, I think we do have to ensure a fair trial based on the facts of the particular case. And what a person has done in the past cannot be used against them
but
in a current case in
America
court.
manages to have fair trials whilst also allowing freedom of speech. And I think we've gone too far in the other direction, that we control things so much that people don't know what the background is, and this leads to trouble, as was part of the problem in the riots in August.
Well, let me just say that the American system is far from perfect. It's very flawed. There are so many miscarriages of justice. But in this particular case, I accept that the police had legitimate fears and anxieties. I just wish they'd exercised those in a non-lethal way so that Chris Kaba could have been taken to a court of law, he could have faced the charges and been duly convicted by a jury.
Well, I always agree with that. The state should never take life if it can possibly avoid it, and people should be tried properly. And we've both agreed that the CPS is utterly useless. Anyway, thank you very much, Peter. It's always a pleasure to have you on. In a moment, could the BBC be playing into the hands of the totalitarian Chinese communists of Peking?
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
There's a huge financial and mental strain for parents, but we have this system now where it talks about they bringing a family member to help, but I don't think that's happening a lot of the time. I think people are having to be off work, look after their child, and often, sorry to say, but their school always calls the mum, and then you have this situation where you have nobody to look after your child. People's grandparents don't seem to want to do it so much, and often family members aren't just down the road. So what we have is no village. And I think it's really important when you have a child that you need that village.
Are children getting more sicker than they used to be? Or is it just that we take the odd sniffle a bit more seriously now since 2020?
Yes, I do think the odd sniffle can be. I know in my school they say 3 days away, you know, the slightest little thing, and it's like...
If you have a cold?
Yeah, no, please, go in, yeah. And
3 days off if you have a cold for a child, and we wonder why all these parents aren't at work. I think some of these figures about people who could be working and aren't working, they're not necessarily on benefits, but some of them will be people who, during the pandemic, particularly parents, decided to get a different work-life balance. They quite liked being at home, and they realised the children are benefiting from it. Do you think those people are in these statistics, Annette?
Of people staying at home with not working?
Who decided to not go back to work of working age?
Yes, I think a lot of people don't want to go into an office anymore either. They've had that little bit of freedom and they're like, I'm not going in. And I know employers are trying to get them to go in, but they just want to be at home. They want to be near their children if their children are sick, whether that's the mum or the dad. And also a lot of people don't live near their office or wherever. They don't want to commute. Train fares have gone up, so they say, well, why should I pay? So you have this whole knock-on effect throughout the economy.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Nana Akwe, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
No, he didn't say that, though.
I'm so surprised.
I think there's an element of truth to that.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with GB News Radio. You can listen online on DAB+ and on the GB News app. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with GB News Radio. We are the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is GB News, the People's Channel.
Well, welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and we were discussing the Chris Kaba trial, and the mail mogs have come in. John says, Dear Jacob, can you explain why it is that Sergeant Martin Blake is being considered for disciplinary action after being found innocent? No, I can't. I think it's perverse of the IOPC. Neil says, if you want a fair trial by jury, is it right that news outlets report names and details of the case before all the information is known? Anyone who watches the news may be influenced. Magna Carta does say that all free men should have a fair trial. Yes, but trials must be public. I think we go in the wrong direction and have too much secrecy. And Neil carries on to say separately, I hear the weather in Somerset is wonderful today, which, of course, it is. Within days of BBC director Tim Davie claiming China, Russia and North Korea are spending billions on propaganda, the public service broadcaster has faced censure for recalling some of its most senior and eminent foreign journalists. Sarah Rainsford, Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, John Sudworth, Edward Lawrence, Matthew Goddard, who are all known to have upset totalitarian regimes in which they operate. So perhaps the BBC wants a quiet life and doesn't want to upset the dictators. State of the Nation understands the BBC finds it very difficult to get its journalist visas to go into China. So is it kowtowing to the totalitarian superpower to get more favourable treatment, or is it just sucking up to the government as Starmer resets relations with the communist Chinese? Well, with me now is former leader of the Conservative Party, Sir Ian Duncan-Smith. Ian, thank you for coming in.
Yeah.
Looking at this list, Rupert Wingfield-Hayes discovered that the Chinese were operating in the South China Sea
illegally.
John Sudworth revealed the Uyghurs were
he took our stuff, the IPAC stuff, and he splashed it, and they went for him directly after that.
And Edward Lawrence got beaten up by the Chinese security services. Yep. So it looks as if the BBC is bringing back to London its most effective reporters who have annoyed the Chinese government. So it really is, it's the kowtow, it's going down, touching its nose to the ground in front of the Chinese communists.
Absolutely right. And what is really worrying about this is that instead of backing them up and supporting them, to bring them back and then replace them, if they're going to do that, if they do at all, with somebody who is more acceptable, it misses the point completely. When the best broadcasters are fantastically brave about what they do, and I have nothing but the highest regard for these because it's a very difficult environment to work in. I mean, the IPAC organisation I organised, by the way, I'm sanctioned by the Chinese government,
yes.
so I have some skin in this game. But the reality is that John Sudworth took the information that had been finally leaked about the genocide, and I say genocide taking place in Xinjiang, and they also used the people for slave labour. And he whipped it out onto the BBC, and he can't go back into Beijing since then. He's had to go, and he works out of Taiwan. So this is what's going on. They bully everybody. They bully British governments, and British governments bend back. I'll give you an example. Foreign Secretary goes over there quite recently, and at Prime Minister's question last week, it was very clear that the leader of the opposition said, will you not just raise the issue of those who were sanctioned, but also say, take those sanctions off? And the Prime Minister said, yes, we're one voice on this. He goes over there, the readout from the Foreign Office, he didn't even raise it because it would have upset the Chinese. So our problem is our way of dealing with China seems more and more to be on bended knee.
There's a statement from the BBC. So it says the BBC isn't recalling any journalists. As part of a £700 million savings plan across the organisation, BBC News set out plans to save £24 million last week. And there are a couple of correspondent posts being closed. There will be a consultation process first, so nothing will change for at least a couple of months. Well, that's a very helpful statement by the BBC. But it seems to me the lesson from this, Wingfield-Hayes, Sudworth and Lawrence, is that you don't want to be a brave journalist who breaks stories, who upsets foreign governments. You just want to take the press releases from the equivalent of the state news agency and get on with it, because that's all the BBC wants. It wants to be a mouthpiece for the regimes.
Well, I think we've learned... This is what's so worrying about this is an echo of the 1930s here. Because, remember, people had managed to find out, key individuals had managed to find out about the deep starvation that was deliberately taking place in Ukraine, by Stalin. This came back to the UK, and all of the great and the good got up and said, this is rubbish, it's lies, etc. That individual got into real trouble. What did we discover later on? Over 2 million people had starved to death in Ukraine because Stalin had stolen the corn to send it abroad for foreign revenues. So the truth is, every time you refuse to accept this stuff, every time you give way to these nations, it's a problem for you. And we have in front of us now, I think, the most dangerous time that I can recall since the ending of the Cold War, and that is that China is at the apex of a totalitarian state organization. I call it the New Axis. North Korea, Russia, Iran, China, now Syria and other Gulf states, and it's growing all the time. In plain view, our job is to expose what they're doing, not to pull people away.
And our Foreign Office has been particularly weak. You're wearing a badge to free Jimmy Lai. I've got Sebastian Lai coming on the programme tomorrow. Jimmy Lai is a British citizen, but the Foreign Office seems to do absolutely nothing about him.
Well, every time we've had these debates, the Foreign Office, up until David Cameron arrived briefly, they kept saying, no, he's a dual citizen and China doesn't recognise dual citizens. And I would argue he is not a dual citizen. He has never held a Chinese passport. He crossed over the border when he was 15 or 16. He's a British citizen, proud British citizen, who would love to have consular access. And up until quite recently, the Foreign Office did not demand consular access because the Chinese refused to recognise his British citizenship. Cameron, to be fair, after a long conversation with him, decided we're going to stop that, and he called him a British citizen. But still they use the Chinese form of this, which is dual national. And it's absurd that we don't stand up for somebody who has been very brave in not leaving Hong Kong, completely unviolent, been arrested, trumped up charges, and now faces a sedition charge for the rest of his life.
And all he's been trying to do is maintain freedom of speech in Hong Kong, which we understood was guaranteed in the joint declaration when we gave Hong Kong up to the Chinese in 1997.
Well, let me give you a very good example of how weak and pathetic we've been. By the way, this is not party pre, because this is what happens in the Foreign Office. When China trashed the Sino-British Agreement, which they did, introduced a new national security law, which basically breaks all of the original agreement, America has sanctioned, I think, well over 12 senior, right-to-the-top officials for doing that. The UK has sanctioned 0, not one person.
Well, when I was Leader of the House and I said something disobliging about China doing this, the Foreign Office was in touch with my office to complain that I'd gone too far within minutes. It's a dreadful, quizzling organisation. Anyway, thank you very much to Sir Ian. In a moment, Rachel Reeves could be facing a fiscal black hole 4 times the size of her original claims, created by her, a black hole of her own making, and one she cannot blame on the Tories.
Hello, good evening and welcome to your GB News weather update from the Met Office. Still plenty of blustery winds across Scotland. Could see some coastal gales by the time we reach the morning. Otherwise, largely dry, just a few showers around, but plenty of clear skies, which means we could see some fog by Wednesday morning. That's because we're saying goodbye to that frontal system down across the southeast, and we've got high pressure building with light winds. That is giving us that fog risk as we head into this evening, particularly across parts of Sussex and Kent, East Anglia, perhaps even seeing some pockets of fog across Wales, the Midlands, parts of Lincolnshire too. So do take care for that Wednesday morning commute. Feeling chilly under those clearer skies too, but a different story across Scotland. We're going to continue to see those winds strengthen overnight, so quite blustery by the time we reach the morning, with a risk of coastal gales, particularly around exposed spots in the northwest. Quite a cloudy picture to start tomorrow too, with some drips and drabs of rain and drizzle around, and quite a cloudy start across Northern Ireland too, perhaps some clearer spells in the far east. A mix of clearer skies and some fog patches to start, but once those clear away, it's actually generally going to be quite a bright day on offer. Plenty of dry weather around, just a few showers perhaps feeding into southern parts of England and later on into Wales and the Midlands. Once again though, across Scotland, those blustery winds continuing, those risk of coastal gales around northwestern exposed spots, and fair amount of cloud around too, with a risk of some light rain at times. Generally, temperatures around about average, but just above across the south and southeast, highs of around 16 to 17 Celsius. Once again for Thursday, once any fog clears in the morning, largely dry and bright across the country, but out to the west we do have some cloud continuing to spill in through the course of the day, with some outbreaks of rain by the time we reach the afternoon. This could be heavy and fairly blustery under those cloudy skies too. More rain and showers as we head towards the weekend with average temperatures. Otherwise, that's it from me. Bye-bye.
Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m, followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain, followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK.
We're ready to keep you up to date with what's happening every half an hour, every single day. Bulletins here on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. We were talking about the BBC kowtowing to communist China, and Glenn has sent a mail in saying, Sir Jacob, did I hear you say Peking? Good for you. I bet you still say Boadicea and Tutankhamun. None of this revisionist nonsense. More power to your elbow. You're quite right. I'm not going to be told by a communist totalitarian regime what to call countries. I say Paris and Florence, and I even say Leghorn. You can mail Mogg if you know where Leghorn is in modern parlance. Former Prime Minister Liz Truss's Economic Advisory Group, the Growth Commission, has warned that Rachel Reeves's planned tax raid next week at the budget could lead to an £84 billion black hole, owing to crippling economic growth. Now we know that the Chancellor loves fictional fiscal black holes, but what will she do when she's forced to reckon with a real one 4 times the size of her fancy one? Well, with me now is my most esteemed panel, journalist and author Michael Crick and former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng. Kwasi, this Growth Commission report is really very important, isn't it? Because it shows the knock-on effect of tax decisions and what they do to the prospect of growth, and that actually if you tax beyond a certain point, you risk getting into a vicious downward spiral.
So, Jacob, you're 100% right. And we used to call it the doom loop, which is essentially very simple. If you raise taxes to try and cover public spending, you're disincentivizing economic growth. And, of course, if you don't get economic growth, you have to raise taxes more to pay for the public spending because you're not going to reduce spending. And this is exactly what Liz and I tried to solve. And, of course, we did it in a bold way, and the rest is history, as it were. But the consequence of not doing the path, going on the path we outlined, is essentially one where, I'm afraid, you've got, they did a deal with the unions, they put the costs up hugely. And in order to cover public expenditure, they're going to have to raise taxes. Very finally, I'll say the real problem isn't what will happen this month, because they'll raise taxes. The problem will be is if they don't get growth, there'll be the second bite of the cherry in 2 or 3 years' time, where they'll have to put taxes up even more. And at that point, I think the country will be in a very difficult place.
And this is difficult, isn't it? Because in year one, tax increases very often get somewhere near the money that is predicted, but then people change their behaviour, and you find that the money doesn't come and that people have left the country or they don't carry out the transactions that would lead to the tax being paid. And this is the risk that Labour is taking with the proposed heavy tax increases at the end of the month.
Yeah, there will always be a certain element of avoidance and evasion. I think that the prospect of people leaving the country is always exaggerated.
Well,
we always hear about people claiming
going.
Well, people come and people go, and you will find that people will be
But the thousands who are going are some of the richest people in the country. They take a lot of money with them.
Well, I think you'll find that there are quite a lot of those people who say they're going and they don't actually end up going. We've seen this before, and because they're patriotic like you, and they realise that there's more to this country than simply rates of tax and.
But the Growth Commission points out that there is no point in working between £100,000 and £150,000. The way you pay marginal rates, if you're at £100,000, you might as well go on the golf course until your salary is going up by about 50%. And this isn't tax avoidance, it's not tax evasion, it's just common sense.
Well, there are all sorts of anomalies in the system, and there are all sorts of anomalies. And in fact, you just had Ian Duncan-Smith on the programme, and he was always very good about this. There are also problems at the bottom, amongst the lower pay.
Actually,
and these things can be and should be ironed out, and they shouldn't be a party political thing.
Jacob is quite right between 100 and 150,000. Yeah. One of the things that really irked me when I was in Treasury briefly was the fact that the top rate of tax, 40%, we essentially froze the threshold of £50,000. Now, when the top rate of tax was introduced, in 1987 or 8, £40,000, which was where it kicked in, was a very big salary. And because we haven't lifted the thresholds, more and more people are essentially, it's called fiscal drag, that's a technical term, are paying the 40% rate. And they're being disincentivized. And this is the middle class. This isn't in the late 80s, it was a rich cohort of people that were paying this tax. Increasingly, they've said they're going to keep the threshold as it is. More and more people in middle-class jobs who are working extremely hard to earn a living will be taxed at this higher rate. And at that point, if you get millions of people who essentially aren't motivated to work, you've got really big problems in an economy.
Well, it's worth remembering, of course. I mean, you reminded us that Nigel Lawson brought taxes down to the 40% rate, and that was after 8 years of Margaret Thatcher's government. So Margaret Thatcher's government survived with much higher tax rates.
Yeah, but we started off at a much higher rate.
Yeah,
but Margaret Thatcher's first thing was to cut tax rates from 98% to 60%.
I know, but the government lasted 8 years.
No, you're right.
8 years at 60% without the sky falling.
So the trajectory was much higher taxes.
Yeah.
Whereas we've come in, thanks to Nigel Lawson, also New Labour. I mean, they didn't move the tax rate. It was only Gordon Brown playing games at the end of his tenure, when he was Prime Minister in 2009-10, where he put up the rate to 50%. So it had been 40%, the top rate, for a very long time. We put it up to, Gordon put it to 50, we put it down to 45, which it still is. And now they've lowered the point at which you have to pay 45%.
Now,
so the problem...
We're going to move on, because there's more to discuss on growth, because the Labour Party is set to reduce growth further with its planned overhaul of workers' rights. Already excessively complex labour laws will be made worse with plans to protect working from home, to abolish zero-hours contracts, as well as many other reforms which Labour's own estimates, which are likely to be on the low side, are expected to increase employers' costs by at least £5 billion a year. So you've got taxes going up, you've got regulation going up. How's anybody meant to make any money in this country?
Well, £5 billion a year within the overall economy is not a huge... It sounds a huge amount of money. It's
big
even
amount.
A huge amount of money to you, Jacob.
It's a big amount. I promise you, even to him.
But it's about 1.5%, isn't it, of employers' costs?
They all add up.
Yeah, I appreciate that. But on the other hand, we have had... decades now, where all the advantage has been on the employer side. The labour movement has been pushed back and back and back and back. Real wages for lower-paid people have barely gone up haven't gone up in 2 decades, and it's about time that the balance was redressed. And there are advantages to that aren't purely measured in immediate financial terms.
I would agree
for
with
instance,
you. Sorry.
Well-being, mental health.
I agree with that. But look, the problem we have now is that we've got very low growth rates. I mean, everyone's crowing about the fact that the OECD and the IMF have increased projections to 1.1%. And that's not very high growth historically. And my issue with this is that if you disincentivise business owners, it's not as if they're going to hire more people and give the people rights. They're simply not going to employ people. So you're going to create a world where there will be fewer jobs, not more, and you'll have more people unemployed, not in the workplace for whatever reason, than you had before, which isn't very clever.
I appreciate that. I mean, I would say that some of the measures that Labour are talking about are likely to have a worrying effect on the likelihood of employers taking on new staff. I mean, for instance, allowing people to go to an employment tribunal, from day one. I think that is going too far, and I suspect that a lot of these measures will be watered down. But we've got to get the balance right here, and I think the balance is too far on the side of capital and not enough on the side of Labour.
So I think
in the 70s, it was too far the other way around.
Look, it's a fair point, but I think now the onus, the real desire and need is to create wealth, and if you're doing measures which harm the creation of wealth, everyone suffers. And in the interests of disclosure, both Jacob and I were responsible for this very area of policy. So this is probably the first time...
Well, there's a great quotation, which I think we can end from. We can finish with what Keir Starmer said. I said before the election, and he said this in August, and I say it again really clearly today, growth. And frankly, by that, I mean wealth creation is the #1 priority of this government. Well, if only that were true. If only for once he would say something that I could believe. Anyway, after the messages from our sponsors, more prisoners are being released. But I have an idea that will free up space in prisons without risking the safety of the public.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
Well, the first thing on in my mind when I heard about this is what has this country come to when we're talking about getting kids as young as 6 years old to be jabbed weekly or however often it is, because they are too fat. Where are the parents in all of this? There's three things actually here that are important. Number one is we do not know the long-term consequences of these jabs. So if I had a child and I was going to let them have the jab, I would be feeling like I'm treating them like a lab rat, to be quite honest with you, because we don't know the long-term consequences. Secondly, the manufacturers are clear that some of the potential side effects can be very serious. We're talking about potentially pancreatitis, let's get my word out, and also it lists as a potential side effect thyroid cancer. Arguably, it's called the gamble jab, to be honest with you, because of these potential side effects at the moment. And then thirdly, I come back to the parents. Where are the parents in all of this? Because they are the role models. So it really is about parenting, and it's about parenting from being a role model yourself in terms of being slim and healthy, and not expecting a jab to take your place and other people to take your place. If you have children, they are your responsibility. Think before you breed. The other thing you need to remember with this is when you stop taking that jab, it is highly likely that you're going to put all the weight back on. Now, the thought of a child of 6 years of age, starting with that jab, conditioning them mentally to live with that jab, as far as I'm concerned, is absolutely not on.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Welcome to State of the Nation, daily plunge into the stories shaping our country. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Monday to Thursday we bring you the insights, the facts, the truth about how our country is being governed. Because what happens in Downing Street matters down your street. Tune in to State of the Nation every Monday to Thursday, 8 to 9 o'clock. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Why go out on a Friday night when Friday night comes straight to your home?
Talking about?
Join me and my A-team of top pundits. Chemistry tonight is electric. As we tackle the big stories of the day with wit, insight and fearless energy.
Man of the people.
It's all vibe.
Just a filing cabinet on wheels with a tie on.
So, order in Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, every Friday at 8, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Over 1,000 prisoners have been released, some of them taken home in Bentleys and Rolls-Royces and all sorts of other fancy cars, onto the streets today as the government tries to tackle overcrowding in jails. Offenders serving more than 5 years will be released on licence after spending 40% of their time behind bars. Now, everything in politics is a choice, a matter of priority. The pretense for opening the prisons is to free up space, and yet there are more than 10,000 foreign nationals in our prisons. Surely it's time to deport these people en masse before releasing prisoners early and potentially putting the public safety at risk. Well, I'm joined now by the Senior Advisor to the Counter-Extremism Project and former prison governor, Ian Aitchison. Ian, thank you very much for joining me. Obviously, there are limits to how full the prisons can be, but don't you think it would be better to repatriate the 10,000 foreign criminals who are in our prison system?
Well, good evening, Jacob. Thanks for having me on again. That's certainly one of the things that we need to look at, and that is speeding up the repatriation of prisoners who've served a sentence who are foreign nationals who can then be deported. There are obviously quite a lot of obstacles in the way of that. And one of the obstacles that isn't talked about is the fact that we've got to make sure that, some of these foreign nationals who've been imprisoned for very serious offences against citizens or people living in this country serve all the time they should serve for the crime they've committed. And it's not always clear that that would be the case, because we've no control over the judicial systems of some of the countries that we might repatriate these people to. But it's certainly one idea that would reduce the prison population. There are others, for example, the fact that we imprison significant numbers of people who've committed non-violent offences for acquisitive crime, often shoplifting, for example, to support a drug addiction. There's no point sending them into our prison system at the minute, because it's almost guaranteed to make them worse when they come out. That's no good for future victims. What we ought to do with those prisoners, and there's a significant number of them, is divert them to what I would call secure, compulsory NHS detoxification treatment.
That sounds, I think sounds like a very good idea, because everything one hears about prisons is that they have drugs going in and out of them the whole time. But shouldn't we be able to secure our prisons so that not only can criminals not get out, but drugs can't get in? Is that impossible?
You'd be forgiven for thinking it's impossible, given all the recent inspection reports that have come out of prisons that are awash with drugs that have caused so much violence and disorder that rehabilitation is effectively impossible. What you need to do in order to guarantee that drugs can't get into prisons is two things. First of all, you need to spend an enormous amount of money in restricting the supply of drugs. There are different vectors for drugs coming into prison. Unfortunately, one of those vectors that we don't talk about enough is staff corruption. But there are other vectors, including ever more sophisticated drones that can deliver quite large quantities of drugs now directly to prisoners' cells. And there are prisons that we have in the country that are in rural areas, for example, that have massive, very big perimeters, where people are able to approach the perimeter of the prison and throw drugs over the top. So if we want to do that, we've got to invest very heavily in technology that defeats or disables illicit mobile phones, in technology that will defeat or disable drones, and in searching 100% of people who go into prison, staff and visitors, 100% of the time. That will require a massive investment of money, because at the moment we simply don't have the technology to do that. But it's worse than that. Forgive me. There are some prisons where we know, like Bedford, for example, which quite recently was the subject of an undercover Times expose, where somebody without any vetting at all became a uniformed operational support grade and was able to walk in literally off the streets of Bedford into the centre of the prison, where he had direct contact with prisoners without being searched or screened at all, passing screening portals, for example, that weren't even staffed. So when you've got that level of incompetence, as well as a level of an underinvestment, which has been going on for years, you've got a recipe for disaster. That's supply. We also have to think about demand then.
Well, that's what you're saying is quite worrying, that you've got a combination of underinvestment in the prisons, too few prison places, and you've got incompetence in the management, so drugs get in. This is not going to be an easy problem to solve at all.
Well, it's not. And one of the things that frustrates me, and I think I'm one of the few people who talk about this, is that it actually suits the government and the unions and criminal justice reformers, largely speaking, to focus almost entirely on overcrowding as being the thing that needs to be defeated in order for our prisons to return to safety, order and purpose, which of course is what we would all like. But if you look at the inspections, the independent inspections that are done, there are significant numbers of our prisons who are revealed as being basically hellholes with, squalor, indolence and violence that are not overcrowded. So something else is happening that needs to have some explanation. If you want to return prisons to safety, decency and order, yes, you're going to have to deal with overcrowding. And let's be quite clear about this. Overcrowding is a problem that the Conservative government has gifted to the incoming administration. It is as a result of awful planning. But
that is a very fair point. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you for joining me again. I've still got my panel with me, journalist Norther Michael Crick and former Chancellor of the Exchequer Kwasi Kwarteng. Michael, when your namesake, Michael Howard, said in the 1990s prison worked, more people started being sent to prison and crime rates seemed to go down. I know that coincidence is not causation, but do you think prison has worked and has made society safer?
No, I'm afraid not. I mean, I agree. I mean, I thought that interview with Mr. Ocean was remarkable. He said so many powerful things, and yet it's such a depressing situation. It's rather like the situation with the economy, that it's not at all obvious which way you go. Actually, the interesting thing about I wrote a book about Michael Howard, and when he made that speech and said that prison works, That was not picked up in the press the following day at all. They picked up other things, and that's the thing that's remembered from it. And he's absolutely wrong, I'm afraid. It's not working. We put far more people in prison than any other country in Western Europe. OK, the Americans put people in prison even more than we do, and it doesn't really work there. And Mr Acheson described this situation of squalor and nastiness and violence and of course, overcrowding. And that, you see, and this is a point he didn't make, but I'm sure he would do, deters good people from being prison officers. Prison officers are not well paid. They're probably worse paid than they were. And that means that they are more susceptible to the kind of corruption. It's all constantly feeding each other. And I think the good thing about this government is that under Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, she seems to be one of the most able members of the Cabinet. They brought in Mr. Lord Timpson to review all of this, and now David Gauke. So all in all, I think, they're going to have to do some imaginative things.
Look, so my issue, I love David Gauke. He's a former colleague of ours, very reputable and clever man, but he's not a law and order conservative. I mean, he doesn't think, I think that prison works, like you just said. Lord Timpson definitely said we put too many people in prison. And frankly, I think they're wrong. I think that I agree with Michael Howard. I think prison does work. I think that Ian Acheson was right. I think we messed things up by not building enough prisons because of the budgetary constraints, and we should have done that. And also, the legal system, I would say, is in a slightly odd place because we let out domestic violence, criminals, violent people. And if you say something offensive on Twitter, and I'm not condoning those remarks, you can get a prison sentence, and that to me is bonkers. People who write offensive things on Twitter, yes, they're breaking the law, but they need to be dealt with in a way that doesn't crowd out.
Overcrowding is not because of too many people saying nasty things on Twitter.
But it's an example. It's an example. We let out this summer.
Yes,
we incarcerated people who wrote offensive and nasty things, which I don't condone, and I think that's wrong. But we incarcerated them. And we let out people who
exactly the same
would have
exactly the same would have happened this autumn if the Conservatives.
I don't think it would have done. I don't think it would have done.
Well, who would you have let out then?
So I think the schemes that we had were, because as Jacob said, it's a choice. I've been on TV programmes that we had to let people out. First of all, they let out too many, and I think the criterion they used was wrong. I think there were people that were let out that had done terrible things, and they were let out because, for whatever reason, political reasons. These are political choices, and it's not fair to say that we had to let out whatever it is, 2,000.
All right, I'm afraid we're going to have to start talking about conkers, which doesn't require the panel. Thank you, my brilliant panel. And finally, things that seem to be too good or too amusing to be true usually aren't true. So last week we covered the allegations that the David Jenkins, otherwise known as King Conker, used a steel conker to win the World Conker Championships. However, after a meticulous investigation, King Conker has been found not guilty, and his name will be engraved on the trophy after all. So congratulations to the conquering king, or if you prefer, the kinkering Kong. Anyway, up next, it's the great Patrick Christys. Patrick, what is on your programme this evening?
Well, Jacob, I mean, that was absolutely conkers. Right, I've got loads coming your way. The prisoner release scheme. We were outside a prison earlier and we saw a bloke hop a barbed wire fence and get into a getaway vehicle, so things are going well. Big up Keir Starmer, seems to be the message from the Mandem. More astonishing detail, though, on a serious note, emerging about Chris Kaba. Should this have ever gone to trial, I am calling for an urgent review of sentencing as well over the riots after Peter Lynch was sadly found dead in prison. Should he have ever been sent to prison? And the Archbishop of Canterbury has revealed his own family has links to the slave trade. Well, why doesn't he pay reparations himself then?
Well, that's a very good question. A very exciting programme coming up. That's after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation. And one of my correspondents on Mail Moggs has already told you that the weather in Somerset was absolutely lovely today. It will be lovely tomorrow and for the rest of the year. Guaranteed.
Even though we'll see a cloudy start, it'll be a bright outlook for the rest of the day. Boxed Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, good evening and welcome to your GB News weather update from the Met Office. Still plenty of blustery winds across Scotland. Could see some coastal gales by the time we reach the morning. Otherwise, largely dry, just a few showers around, but plenty of clear skies, which means we could see some fog by Wednesday morning. That's because we're saying goodbye to that frontal system down across the southeast, and we've got high pressure building with light winds. That is giving us that fog risk as we head into this evening, particularly across parts of Sussex and Kent, East Anglia, perhaps even seeing some pockets of fog across Wales, the Midlands, parts of Lincolnshire too. So do take care for that Wednesday morning commute. Feeling chilly under those clearer skies too, but a different story across Scotland. We're going to continue to see those winds strengthen overnight, so quite blustery by the time we reach the morning, with a risk of coastal gales, particularly around exposed spots in the northwest. Quite a cloudy picture to start tomorrow too, with some drips and drabs of rain and drizzle around, and quite a cloudy start across Northern Ireland too, perhaps some clearer spells in the far east. A mix of clearer skies and some fog patches to start, but once those clear away, it's actually generally going to be quite a bright day on offer. Plenty of dry weather around, just a few showers perhaps feeding into southern parts of England and later on into Wales and the Midlands. Once again though, across Scotland, those blustery winds continuing, those risk of coastal gales around northwestern exposed spots, and fair amount of cloud around too, with a risk of some light rain at times. Generally, temperatures around about average, but just above across the south and southeast, highs of around 16 to 17 Celsius. Once again for Thursday, once any fog clears in the morning, largely dry and bright across the country, but out to the west we do have some cloud continuing to spill in through the course of the day, with some outbreaks of rain by the time we reach the afternoon. This could be heavy and fairly blustery under those cloudy skies too. More rain and showers as we head towards the weekend with average temperatures. Otherwise, that's it from me. Bye-bye.
We'll see a cold snap, which will quickly develop into a warm front. Boxed Boiler Repairs, sponsors of weather on GB News.
This is the final week to grab your chance to win